Welcome to How to Belong, the podcast that delves into the human quest to find a sense of belonging in what can often feel like a lonely world. Join us as we talk to guests who've navigated their own unique paths, what we like to call their hero journeys, from feeling like they don't fit in, to the profound realisation that true belonging can only ever be found from within. I'm Naomi E. Lloyd, and this is the How to Belong podcast. Hello and welcome back to How to Belong podcast. Today's guest is someone who has spent her career at the forefront of peace building and negotiation, navigating some of the most difficult conflicts of our time. Sanam Naraghi Anderlini is a peace strategist, the CEO of the International Civil Society Action Network, host of the If You Were in Charge podcast, and one of the very few trained female UN peace negotiators. What a guest to have on the How to Belong podcast. With nearly 30 years of experience, Sanam is a leader in global efforts for peace and women's rights. And she's here today to share her insights on belonging in, let's face it, an increasingly polarised world. So without further ado, Sanam, welcome to the How to Belong podcast. How are you?
It's lovely to be here. I'm good. Happy New Year. And it's lovely to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, I'm delighted to have you on here. And I'm particularly grateful because we were just having a quick chat before we press record. I hope you don't mind me mentioning it to the listeners, Sanam, but you've had quite an eventful few days. Are you happy to just sort of fill us in on and how your experience has been in the beginning, the first week or so of January?
Yeah, it's been a strange week. On Monday, I was invited to a conversation with our foreign secretary here in the UK and some others around just UK policies and the state of the world and so forth. And then I discovered an email in my spam folder that was an invitation to President Carter's state funeral Monday evening because we have ridiculous security in our email systems gone into spam. So I had to scramble and ask them if it was still possible to go. So I went to the States for the funeral and thought whether it was a good idea to go and whether it was extravagant and so forth. And honestly, it was like a booster shot of inspiration and a reminder of, why each of us has a role to play in exactly these issues of belonging and peace and justice and to kind of be inspired by a man who dedicated his life to being good. Many people aspire to greatness. Very few manage to retain goodness through their lives. And it was just really lovely to be able to be there and to hear the eulogies and to just be part of something very historic.
I think that's an amazing start for this year, and I'm very privileged to be able to talk to you about it. We've all seen the footage that's been coming out of seeing all the remaining 5 presidents that are alive at the moment. That in itself was an image, seeing Barack Obama and President Trump sitting next to each other. And I think we're going to move on specifically into all the different areas of how this connects to belonging. But I think it's almost self-explanatory that, the word living in a polarized society, then you get something like a state funeral like that, and it brings everybody together for this moment of just unity and peace. Did you get that sense when you were there that everybody was putting the division aside for an afternoon?
It was interesting because the contrast, this is again just my own personal opinion, but the contrast between what President Carter represented, during his life, in his presidency, it was a one-term presidency, but the eulogies talked about what he achieved. So he was the first person to put solar panels on the White House, and he passed legislation around environmental issues and public education, and put more women into the sort of courts and judiciary system than previous presidents, and did more on dealing with racial segregation and incarceration, like all these things that he represented during his presidency. And then in the 50 years after, he became he ended his term when he was 56. He died at 100. Right. And so he had this whole other life. Right. And to see that and the values he represented around repeatedly people saying President Carter was known for saying to the public, I will always tell you the truth. Right. And I will. And he dealt with difficult issues like Palestine. He really took a forward leaning position on that, called it apartheid many years ago. To see that in contrast to what Trump represents and what Trump is doing. Sorry, did that noise bother you?
I can't pick it up. Like we'll work it out.
Okay.
I'm just I'm so engrossed in what you're saying.
Yeah.
Well,
So I was saying that the contrast between what President Carter represented and his values, the work that he did, the way he lived his life. He was married for 77 years to the one woman that he was in love with, and this family and so forth. And then to have at the other extreme what Trump has represented and represents, right? And then in between were these other presidents, right? There's Bush and there's George W. Bush and there's Obama and Clinton. And it was, for me, it was very interesting because it was like, this is what we could be. Carter represents something that is so profoundly significant. And as I say, maintaining that goodness, not just attaining greatness, but just maintaining that goodness. And then how the others have compromised on integrity and on values. And especially again for Biden right now, what he's done with Gaza and continuing to sell weapons or give weapons to Israel and so forth. And then Trump, and it was just really striking to think about the room in that way, or the space, these five people there. But there were others there, and part of what I found interesting was that the organization of getting 4,000 people into the National Cathedral in Washington, they asked us to go somewhere as a sort of to get on buses, and you would see former senators and others standing in line behind us. It wasn't like obviously they must have had their VIPs and so forth that needed security. But there were a lot of important people, and everybody was just standing in line, waiting to go and getting on buses together and stuff. And I was like, that's also a testament to how genuinely democratic and inclusive President Carter was, because a whole variety of people were there, and it was very nice to just observe that and feel the atmosphere. And it was hopeful. I came back feeling more inspired and certainly more energized about the kind of work that I do and how we have to carry the torch forward.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. I feel privileged to, be speaking to you about that. What strikes me is it must be quite challenging for you in the work that you do. Feeling it's so obvious when I speak to you just how passionate you are. Just using words like just goodness. No, never not necessarily even greatness, but goodness, and just bringing people together. And having that sense of being able to be at oneness, and then often in a place where you're dealing with the opposite of that, or so much polarization. What advice would you have all these tactics that you must have obviously tried to build and learn and teach people. What advice would you give to? I'm going to go straight to the young generation that are growing up in this world where you haven't got Carter as a president, and we have this huge division, and we've just it's January 2025. Goodness knows, particularly in America, what the conversations around a lot of people's family Christmas tables will have been if they manage to avoid politics. It's very clear that people are very divided about how they feel about these things. How can we achieve some level of peace or some level of living in a world where we can belong to our values and hold on to them, but without losing our relationships in the process? Does that make sense?
No, and I think it's honestly, it's like the gazillion-dollar question that we're all faced with, because if you have if you're lucky enough to be in a family setting where you have similar values, of course it's easier, right? You're sort of in an echo chamber of some sort. But I think that the first thing is to kind of acknowledge that even in our own family context, because of maybe it's because of the way the information sources are so diffuse, right? And we, by virtue of the work that we do, maybe we end up just being immersed in one approach or one perspective. It's really easy to sort of see division and difference rather than similarity and social cohesion. So, for example, in my universe, we work, of course, with a lot of human rights organizations and civil society and people that are doing public service of one sort or another. I have relatives who are in the private sector, and they are so disparaging about the public sector because from their experience, public sector is not good, it's not efficient. And we look at private sector and we're like, well, look at how they exploit people, right? And I think that part of it is that we have to learn to be able to sit together and actually unpack kind of the kinds of societies we want to have, right? and then seeing and trying to understand what positive things do I bring from my perspective? What does the private sector bring? What are the changes that need to be, compromises that each of us have to make, right? And it's hard because we're not even in the same room. Like, in my work, I often say, well, I work in conflict areas, and we keep saying that peace is good for business. Like peace is if you think about peace as a metaphor of a canvas that you give an artist, right? It's like, you give Picasso a beautiful paints to paint a masterpiece. But if the canvas is stretched and torn, whatever color he puts on there, it's going to fall through, right? So if you don't have peace at the baseline of your society, education, healthcare, whatever jobs that you create, it all falls through because you don't have that basic sense of safety and security and social cohesion. We've taken that so much for granted over the last 60, 70 years, post-war. And it is becoming frayed. And so we need to come back and talk to each other and understand each other's perspective without being sort of prejudiced, if you want. So why don't we have conversations with companies? Because a lot of companies will look at what my organization ICANN is, or will look at my profile and think that I'm some crazy feminist activist. And what do I know about the private sector, right? And I'm going to come in and kind of wag my finger at them. And it's like, no, that's not really the point. What I'm trying to say is, hey, tourism industry, let's say, when a bomb goes off somewhere, the first industry that gets affected is the hotel industry and the airline industry and the insurance industry and so forth. So actually, the work that we're trying to do to foster social cohesion and peace is good for a whole array of others. But at the moment, we're not even talking to each other. So that initial thing of how do we communicate and where do we find the spaces? How do we go into each other's spaces to talk to each other and to hear the other? I think is something that needs to happen. And you can think about that, as I say, sectorally, or you can think about it in terms of family or in terms of communities that at the moment, black, white, whatever, however you want to frame the divisions that have been created amongst us.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned that somebody could look at your profile and they're making a judgment already about what they think you may say or may do or may believe in. And that makes me think about the sort of pressure point of when we put on our people's identity. So, I think you mentioned to me before that each person doesn't have just one identity. We identify in lots of different ways. And you have to, in the way that we live now, sometimes we have to sort of pull out put on our different identity cloaks according to the circumstances. So, in that example of you talking to tourism industry, you may bring a different part of your identity out there to get them to listen. Is that what we're meant? Do you think that's what we're meant to be? We're meant to adopt more of a chameleon approach in life. So, or does that go against the idea of belonging to yourself because you're putting on different hats or different cloaks? I'm using different attire here in my head in order to get somebody to talk to you. Because if they're going to block you because they've decided, well, you're a feminist or you're this or you're that. But yeah, if I approach with a different identity hat, I'm going to have more chance of getting some sense of peace or a conversation going. What do you think about that?
I think so. So one, around the question of identity, I think all of us have multiple identities, and as we go through life, we acquire new ones. Some become more muted, some become more elevated, depending on our age and So, for example, becoming a mother, right? Like from being single to being married to being a mother of young children, right? And then right now I'm an empty nester but the mother of twins, right? You connect with people. The minute I see somebody else who has twins, we have a different bond, right? We may have very, very different approaches to everything, but I have a connection all of a sudden with somebody who's got twins. It's not as if I'm pretending to sort of to shape shift just to engage with them. It's genuinely a part of who I am, right? And you can think about that in an array of ways. Working mothers, where you studied, what you studied, what kind of sports you like, what kind of, I'm like, we could divide up the room by saying milk chocolate lovers and dark chocolate lovers. Why is that less significant than say, I don't know, what faith I was born into, right? I mean, there's so many, because right now we're sort of put at a maximum when we think about identity. It's this notion of intersectionality. I'm at the intersection of female, beige, and, sort of whatever, middle age. But I'm much more than that. And I'm not stuck there. And I'm constantly moving, and I'm adding things as I go along. The languages we see, I mean, it's just endless. So I've in my work, I've started talking about it and wanting to write about it in terms of quantum identities, because it's almost like we have multiple parts of ourselves that are bouncing around. And then, some part of me bounces and connects with you, but another part of me might bounce and connect with someone else. All of it is very authentic. It's just being conscious and owning it, as opposed to feeling that I should be one thing and I should box myself in one way, or allowing someone else to box us and determine where we fit, which box we fit into it. I hate boxes. I've never liked this kind of approach, because or to put it in a simple way, I'm like, we live in very diverse, pluralistic societies. That's just the nature of the world right now. It's extreme pluralism. And we have a choice of going from diversity to differences, right? You and I can sit here and talk a lot about our differences and then the divisions that come about from those differences. Or we can look at it and say, yes, we're different backgrounds, age, all sorts of things that are different about us. But actually, what is it that makes us similar? And then what is it that brings us together and allows us to have like the social cohesion of a society, like an orchestra? Lots of different instruments, but together, or a Persian carpet, lots of different threads, but you're weaving a collective, unified vision. That's the direction that we need to be looking at and thinking about, and seeing how we can empathize and see ourselves in somebody who may, on the surface, look very, very different or sound very different.
I think that's an incredible the way you've explained that. What did you refer to it as? Multi-identities.
It's I call it quantum, because quantum. It's, from quantum. Yeah, it's like when you think about quantum physics, it's about atoms that are like bouncing. It's all very dynamic, and I'm like, that's what it is. We're walking around and it's dynamic. We're not static beings. We have all these things, and so if you're aware of it, then it's like, which part of me do I kind of bounce off this person who seems so different to me?
I think we do naturally do that when we've got the space to do it, and we're privileged enough to live in a world where we can see our different friends at different times or interact with different groups of people in a safe, secure environment. Then you're able to introduce these different personalities or these different identities as you go along. But maybe it's having the confidence to let these different parts of you come forward, or to search out where you can connect with somebody. Because, like you say, it's very easy to walk into a room and to see somebody who doesn't look different to you, dresses differently to you, who has a different accent, or just appears to be. Maybe you identify somebody naturally a bit more extrovert, and you tend to avoid introverted people. And this is something I will admit to, that I think, say about 10 years ago, until I started thinking about it more, I thought I was quite an extroverted person. I since realised that he's much more complex than that, and I've got a real mix of two. But partly because I have a quite significant hearing loss, I think that's another side of it as well. If somebody was very quietly spoken or came across as quite shy, in a way, I would almost be a bit wary of going towards that person. Because I think, I don't want to overwhelm them. And what if I can't hear them? And then I'll talk too much because I'll be trying to make up for the space. This is just something that I'm thinking in my head now. And I've realised now that some of the most interesting and valuable connections I've made with people when I've overridden that initial feeling and I've gone towards somebody that I wouldn't naturally have gone for, rather than the sort of the one that's dancing and shouting in the corner. I naturally before would have gone, yay, you seem like that's going to be, I'm going to understand that. And now I think, well, explore more. And usually you find the little gems in those places where they're a little bit more complicated, where the landscape might be a little bit more tricky to navigate, but there's something to be found there. Can you relate to that at all?
100%. I think the beauty of being surprised and kind of also being humble, right? That we make an assumption about people, and then if you engage, you suddenly realize that there's so much more behind it, or so much the diversity of experiences. As you said, sort of, I would never know whether you have hearing issues or not, right? But to suddenly realize, wow, there is a whole other aspect to you, and what life experience does that bring into your life, and how is that different? So I think that it's it's the curiosity. It's wanting to see different, because it's very easy as you get older in life to just stay in your comfort zone of your old friends and your mates and everybody just sort of slightly converges and becomes a little, like similar, right? And to have the courage to be able to have the conversations that are different and still be friends. I mean, we can't all be the same about everything all the time, right? So I think it's that. And one of the things that I keep coming back to is that the experiential, being in person with others. Like during COVID, many of us were on Zoom calls. I don't remember anybody that I met new on Zoom. They really didn't register with me. But if I've met them in person, it's a different energy. And then if you've met somebody in person and you've done an activity with them, gone on a hike, gone to the movies, or just done something that is experiential, the bonding that happens there is very, very different. So thinking about that for young people as well, that go do things, go find different, it doesn't, maybe it's sculpture, maybe it's you go to a dance class, maybe you join a hiking group, it doesn't matter, but it's the going into spaces where you're sharing some kind of physical, emotional experience. And then that opens channels for conversations and for seeing the humanity in others, right? It's like, oh, very different people, but we're standing in a sculpture class together and trying to, sculpt this one person or what. And then the other thing that I learned, and I mentioned sculpture because I'd always wanted to try it. And last year I was in Germany and managed to find a class. There were 6 of us, and for 6-7 weeks, we sculpted the same model. It was the same guy, same face. It was the head of this guy. At the end of the process, there were 7 different, statue, whatever, head sculptures of this man. Not one of them looked similar to the other one. And I thought, partly this is talent. Some people are more talented than others. But it's also, for me, it was a awakening in terms of, wow, we're looking at the same person. And at the end of the day, we're seeing different things, different parts of them. The depth of diversity of experience. And you and I can be looking at the same painting and we notice different things. It's just interesting. It's just being conscious of that you are unique, but your point of view is not the only one out there. And the more we can talk to each other about it, the more important it is, because we learn and then we see things and it just exposes us and widens our own horizons.
I love the idea of going to a sculpture class. You've got me thinking now, or just finding something where I wouldn't normally go and just seeing who. I've often found that you meet people on dog walks and things like that because you have something in common. But if the dog wasn't there, you might not have started talking, that sort of thing. But it's a way of connecting together. Wow, it's such a big topic. It really is. And me thinking about meeting people in dog parks and there's you going to President Carter's funeral. So you have very different experiences of interaction with people. Yeah. But it still comes down to the same principles that we shouldn't be living in silos, and we shouldn't try not to stay in this echo chamber all the time of the similar homogenous type people that you want to be around. It's safe.
And it's we're a very interesting generation. I mean, this era in human history, because when I was growing up in England in the 80s, on Thursday evening, there would be Top of the Pops. Every teenager in this country was watching Top of the Pops. Class, background, etc. We were all following the same music. There were 3 and then 4 television channels, right? The same soap operas, the same news. So it was through media we were kind of being connected as a society. And in anthropology, we call it imagined communities. It's like these ways in which politically, culturally, our society as on a mass scale, not just a local village and a local town, but 60 million, 70 million people are being connected. And then in the last 20, 30 years, with the internet and with all of the different ways in which media has been sort of stripped aside and atomized and so forth, we've lost that, right? We've lost, are we all listening to the same music? Did we all watch the same news? Whether it's Channel 4 or BBC, we're getting our news from different sources. Social media platforms are using us to channel algorithms and kind of put us in the same loops and so forth. And we need to be conscious of that and figure out how you get out of it. And again, to me, how you get out of it is by forcing yourself to go and read the things that don't even exist in your phone, or looking at where else do I read, or talking to your friends and saying, okay, you're reading this, what else should I read? But also being going out on your dog walk and whatever it is, the dance class and and other spaces where you might just come across people that are completely different to you, and being exposed. But it's become a lot harder, I think.
It's absolutely true. I mean, I was talking in the marketing firm that I work at. Somebody said, "What are you watching now?" And even when we have this conversation about what you're watching on TV, I didn't have all the channels that they had, and they didn't have all the channels I had. So it just stopped the conversation immediately. And you're absolutely right. Years ago, we would have all been watching I used to watch Quantum Leap, actually. I don't know if you ever came across that, but you just made me think of it because you talked about quantum identities. Oh, Tuesday night was Quantum Leap night, and you could talk about it. Yeah. So you're a mother of, I'm just going to just shift gears slightly and more into your life experience, if that's okay with you. Now, I know that you've got twin girls, and they're both at university, is that right?
So they both finished their first degrees, and one is now doing a PhD, and the other one is actually working and probably going to go back to do a second degree in a couple of years' time, or next year or something. Yeah.
And I've heard your daughter talk to you on your podcast, which is a brilliant podcast.
Thank you.
What's the name of the podcast? If You Were in Charge.
If You Were in Charge, yeah.
It's such a good name. I love the name. And I've listened to some of the episodes. It's fascinating guest. And I think it's really lovely that you bring your daughter on to discuss the guest and the topics that you're going to be talking about. As a mum of twin girls, what's your experience been of how they've managed to find their own sense of belonging together and as individuals? Because I just think you are, as your career, working on conflict resolution and peace building, but when it's in your own family, it must be very, very difficult to apply those sort of principles.
It's so funny because there were moments where I would take like the theoretical or conceptual things that we had learned or was part of the field of conflict resolution, and I'd kind of try and test it out with the girls, and I was like, oh my god, like this theory is all nonsense, because they're identical twins as well. So it's a few things like along the way when they were very, very little, like 2-3 years old. I mean, it was toddlers, and I remember I would say to them, hitting is not an option. Like, you're not allowed to hit each other. A lot of people, culturally, like if a kid bangs their head against a chair, they'd be like, and the chair hurts them. Then people are like, they give the chair a little slap, and they're like, oh, bad chair. And I was like, I can't do that because most of the time they're banging up against each other.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, violence is a choice, and so hitting is not an option. And then I remember one day they were just being so naughty, and I said, stand in front of you look at me, and if you don't stop doing whatever, you're going to get a spanking. And this little voice, 4 eyes, looked at me, and this little voice said, but you said hitting isn't an option. And I was like, wow, what we say to them gets into their head. Like, it's, what did I know about parenting, really? But it was just, I was like, it makes a difference what we say and how we behave and so forth. So that was part of it. Of course, there were times when they would have fights and things. But the other thing was very much saying to them if I did something wrong, but also getting them to say to each other and to me to apologize. Because for some reason, as adults, people don't want to apologize. Whether it's big problems, big political spaces, corporate, it's as if an apology is you're putting yourself in a position of weakness. And I'm like, no, apology is showing a strength of character. So this question of you apologize and you're about things. And of course I had to, as I say, if I got upset with them or I did something wrong, I would also try and apologize, make sure that I was practicing what I was preaching. But when they were slightly older, they wanted, their pronoun was we. Oh. We do this, and we, until they went one summer when they're about 14, 15, they went to separate sort of summer camps for a couple of weeks. And they came back and they were start saying I. And it was because with these people that didn't know they were twins, they would say, well, we do this. And people were like, why do you say we? Like, what are you? And so it was very interesting to see them getting their own sense of I am this, and that sense of separation. They did go through a period where one of them in particular wanted to assert her independence, and they were in the same classes and the same school and everything. And as a parent to begin with, you don't realize it, but then there's a point where you're like, imagine 24/7, all your life, there's somebody else there, and they look like you, and it gives you a certain strength. I think it, gave them a certain confidence when they needed it. But also, of course, when you're teenagers, you're trying to find your own identity. So that was an interesting moment. And then they decided for university, one came to England and one stayed in the States. And I think actually that physical separation was the key to their emotional closeness now, and they're very close. So over the years we've seen different iterations of this. But one story that I remember was in conflict resolution. Very often they say, people will take positions, but if you create the space for them to have a dialogue, then that you show their interest, and then they'll be rational about solving the problem. And there's an exercise around, there are 5 oranges and 2 sisters, and one ultimately wants just the peel, the other one wants the fruit. Well, with my girls, I did it. I said, there's one plate, and and each of you wants this plate. But I said to one of them, you want it in the morning, and I said to the other one, you want it in the afternoon. And the idea is that once they realize that if they each agree that okay, they can share the plate, then both can have it. And if they don't agree that they can share the plate, then nobody has it. So they started this conversation. They realized that they can share the plate. So I asked one of them, will you share the plate? And she said, yes. And I asked the other one, will you share the plate? And she said, no. I said, well, why not? And she started giggling, and she said, because I don't want her to have it. And I was like, this is, this is when I say like these theories burst out, because I'm like, we have a lot of political leaders who are psychopaths and sociopaths, and I get more pleasure out of the pain of someone else than they do in the gain for themselves kind of thing. And in this little exercise with them, I mean, she was giggling, but the idea that a 10-year-old will automatically think, I'm just going to bug you and I'm going to annoy you, and I get more pleasure out of annoying you than getting the plate that I want. So I was like, it's just interesting to know these things, because where economists have told us that we're all rational beings, and I'm like, what does rationality mean? It's all kind of slightly, she was being rational, but you could argue that she was being irrational just because she didn't get what she wasn't getting what she wanted. And I was like, she was getting pleasure in a different way. So anyway, so it's been fun kind of dealing with them on these issues in many ways.
I can only imagine. And like you say, having somebody who's, you always refer to it as we, who look just like you. I mean, we could, because we in our relationships, they say that, we do mirror each other. If you spend a lot of time with each other, in friendships, I've seen it. We spent a lot of time in a group, and then somebody's got a little idiosyncrasy or a little thing that they laugh in a certain way, or they make a certain joke or roll their eyes in a certain way, and you start noticing that other people do it as well. They start copying them because you're in that group mentality. But for twins, there must be something where there's a push to do that because it's natural, but at the same time there's a pull to sort of, I have my own, whether that's also lots of quantum identities that I belong to. And as a mother, I don't know how you manage that.
So it's interesting, because with twins, on the one hand, they're trying to be different, right? So it's like, because they're similar at heart, they're as identical twins, they're trying to be different. But then the irony is that there's so many similarities. So very often, even now, they would come home from school, or I see one of them, and they've done something, let's say they did something together over the weekend, and one will come and she's like, Mommy, and then this happened, and then and this, and I'll get the whole story about some incident. And then 2 hours later, the next one comes in. You won't believe it, but this happened, and it's the same story. Oh. So I'm like, so it's very sweet, because when they were little, I would have to sort of keep pretending that, oh my God, and really, and then and then as they've gotten older, like if they notice that I kind of know the story, they laugh about it. But it's the instinct is to try and they'll do their hair differently, and they'll dress differently, and they want to have different friends, and just to because we want to assert our individuality, right? But biology also kicks in, because if your DNA is the same, I mean, the epigenetics is different. We learned all about epigenetics, which is all about kind of the different ways in which our DNA and the environment mixes together. But there's a core where I'm like, it's just extraordinary. Yeah, they are the same, and yet so it's a different.
Well, perhaps you were certainly destined to be the mother of identical twin girls, because you have so many skills that a lot of people don't have to help them navigate all the beauty of it all, and perhaps the tricky parts of it. So that's lovely.
It taught me. I think honestly through life, dealing with them was one of the ways in which I would kind of bring my work into into our family kind of setting in terms of dealing with them. But so often it was like watching them and learning from them and taking it out. That it's been mutually extraordinary. I think for me anyway. Sort of.
Do you find then that your close relations and your friends, a bit like if you're friends with a therapist, do people see you in a bit of a interesting way because they think, well, Sanam's not going to disagree with me, or should we bring Sanam into this conversation because she'll be able to help us? Do you feel like you're being sort of sometimes brought in to help resolve things for other people?
No, not really in that way. Partly because I think over the years, the work that I was doing was so different to most people. Like it was just such a different universe, right? In terms of my own family, friends, and people I'd grown up with, that I just kind of, and also when you work on war and conflict, it's a choice that I made. So it wasn't something that I necessarily wanted to bring into my personal settings, because other people may not be able to cope actually with the types of traumas that for me are slightly kind of, this is the world that I deal with, right? The issues and then the knowledge that I have. So it was, I tried to sort of keep it separate, and it was but to your point, I think what happens is that there is what I realized in my work is that in a way, by being female, 5'5.5", not particularly threatening, it's disarming. And so when you start having a conversation with someone and it's a non-judgmental conversation, people will share, right? And then the other thing that I find, and I try and do it in my work, but it's that it's really easy to be negative and to criticize and to be kind of like, well, that doesn't work, and to sort of analyze in like all the sort of the issues that create conflict and division. And for me, part of my own philosophy is that, well, what's working and how do we elevate the good things that are happening, and can we reframe conversations to sort of, and to see the good, like to genuinely recognize that someone is doing extraordinary work, and to say to them, that's fantastic, like you are an extraordinary human being, right? And I think that approach also just gives people the confidence to feel they can trust. And then once you have the trust, then people will speak and share and so forth. So I think it's just these different things, because when someone is criticizing you, shut down immediately, right?
Yeah.
It becomes like, but if someone's like, well, that's great, and let's, tell me more or whatever, then it becomes a more constructive conversation.
And I guess you must find that being a host of your podcast, because you're discussing some really huge political situations with your guests, but because even if you're online, there's still something very warm and inviting and like you say, disarming about it, that you can use all those skills when you're interviewing people as well. So I'll be taking tips from you.
Well, thank you. No, it's that's a really, it's been really interesting, and partly because of the world that I'm in and the people that I know are, it's such an invisible space when you compare it to what's out in our cultural space. I say, there hasn't been a Netflix series or a story that's about our universe or the kind of people I work with. When you say, oh, there's, let's have inevitably, it's like, oh, it's really important to have a woman who's an activist, and everybody will say, oh, well, let's get Malala, the young Pakistani girl, which she's fantastic. But I'm like, there are hundreds and thousands of other people out there that are doing extraordinary work, but they're just not known, right? And so in the podcast, I really wanted to give the space to take big issues and show that there are real human beings that are rounded and have, can be fun, can be interesting, but they're trying to solve the problem. And as easy as it is to sort of sit there and go, well, you're only doing this and that's not really working, or that's going to be really hard. It's partly saying, yes, it's really hard, but look at how far you've gone. And look at what you're, and what else do you think could be possible? And what I like about the sort of, when I ask them, if you were in charge, what would you do? Is that the solutions that people are giving are incredibly doable. They're not pie in the sky nonsense. It's very, very practical, but really transformative, right? And so part of the reason why I'm doing the podcast is I hope that it does inspire younger people to think they can pick up the baton and carry on, and there are things that can be done, and we build on each other's achievements. That's what we should be doing anyway, and so it's just really nice to be able to give that exposure to the extent that I can through the podcast.
I agree with you that the question you ask them, the answers that you get are actually very doable, and that's, to me, I found it quite comforting that there are people out there that maybe one day be able to take that place. I listened to one of the first episodes you did with Abby Disney, for example.
So Walt Disney and his brother set up the Disney company. And the brother was called, I think, Ray. And so Abby is Walt Disney's grandniece and the granddaughter of the brother, basically. Yeah,
right.
It's that family. And yeah, so she was, yeah. So you listened to her to that episode.
I did, and I found it. I actually came away feeling really positive because it was. I never would have imagined that perspective. It was so interesting, and I won't give anything away. If anybody wants to go and listen to that, I think that's probably one of your first episodes. But it was inspiring to hear that you can be so wrong about your perceptions about people, and you could really get dragged down in negativity as well, living in this world that we do. That always, like you say, we're fed this news of the bad and the evil and the good, and then you listen to all these episodes of people, and you say, what would you do if you were in charge? And then you hear these fantastic ideas. It's life reaffirming, I think, when you hear that. So it's a very positive podcast that you're doing. So thank you for putting that out into the world, and thank you for joining me, because I know that the listeners of How to Belong, I'm absolutely convinced, will find this really interesting, and it's a really different interview. A lot of the interviews I've done is usually really sort of tracking somebody's journey from maybe not feeling like they fitted in to belonging, and with you we're having a bit of a different conversation, but weaved in there we're getting all these lovely nuggets of the gems actually, about belonging and peace building and negotiation. I wondered if I could ask you a question, just sort of to coming towards the end of our chat. How do you find your sense of belonging? It's a big question, I know, but if I put it out there, I wondered what you thought.
That's a really good question, and again, I've had to create it in different ways. So on the one hand, I am privileged in the sense that I come from a very large family, and when the Iranian Revolution happened in 1978-79, and many of us were forced out of the country, we ended up in different places around the world, in Europe and in America and so forth. But our parents, because of my grandfather's own philosophy, made the effort to bring us together as cousins, and then, as we got married, our children and so forth, and we've continued that. So I have this incredible sense of belonging to this. We're now like a global clan, and if I go to New York, I have a cousin I can stay with at their house. When I was living in Germany, people would come and stay with me in Berlin. I had like a little outpost of the family kind of there. So that sense of belonging is extraordinary, because it's like very deep roots, right? And a sense that, and I've tried to give that to my children as well, that they are part of something that is quite unique. But then in my work, I've also kind of either replicated or been inspired by my family setting to say, at ICANN, which is the organization I founded, we spearhead an alliance of independent, locally rooted women peacebuilding organizations. And that to me is another place where I belong, because it's people that are like-minded and the same values. And when I'm together with them, my Nigerian colleagues and my Yemeni colleagues and Afghan and Colombian and others, we may come from different social backgrounds, economic backgrounds, age, some are deeply sort of imbued in their faith, others are not. But we're all drawn to this idea of peace building. And that gives me another sense of belonging, right? Yeah. So with my work, I've sort of created and found a community of people that are like-minded or like-hearted, I should say, in their work and in their vocation. And that's another space that I feel deep belonging. And then I moved to America in my 30s, and I'd lived in England for 22 years, and I realized how British I was. So now that I'm back in England, I have such joy in reconnecting with my old school friends and that community and feeling belonging. So it's thinking about it in different ways. But what I also find at the core of it maybe is that I have to belong to myself, right? And I have to be able to see myself in these different spaces. And I hope that whether you know me through my work or through my family or through my friends or through, somewhere where I go give a speech publicly, that I'm the same person, that it's the inside of what my kids know of me and what my work environment knows publicly. I hope that it's the same, because I think that's the essence of belonging, is as actually belonging to yourself and to the pieces of yourself that you acquire through life and the experiences that you have through life.
Absolutely. That's actually at the sort of core of what I talk about in the podcast, or what I would say that I'm still on that journey to find a little bit. But that's why it's lovely talking to people like you. And I'm so glad you said that about belonging to yourself, because that's ultimate. It's ultimate belonging, because it's the only constant, isn't it? If you belong to yourself,
it takes time. It takes So I was going to say that it takes a bit of time to get to that point of thinking, I am what I am. This is who I am, and good bits, bad bits, whatever, and I'm okay with it, right? It's like, and these are my values that I'm going to try and live by and practice my life by. So I think the sooner you get there, the happier you are as a person. But some people never get there, and I really encourage people to just embrace it and to be honest with themselves, and just kind of belong to yourself, and then be out there in the world in terms of how you would want people to treat you and treat them and so forth.
Wonderful. The best advice you could possibly give anyone, and it's coming from you, so even more valid, I would say. Absolutely wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. You must be shattered, having done a 48-hour trip to America, and such an emotional but positive experience. And very privileged that you still joined us on the podcast. And could you just tell the listeners a little bit where the best place to find you if they want to connect? I know you have your podcast, so that's on all the major streaming platforms.
Yeah. So the podcast, If You Were in Charge, is on Spotify and iTunes, and it's also on our website. The website is icanpeacework.org. And you can see a lot more.
It's wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us on How to Belong, and I wish you an amazing year. I'm so pleased that it started off in such a positive way for you, and thank you for sharing all your incredible wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me and being patient, and I hope you have a great year. And let's work on this idea of belonging and pluralism and how important it is for the next generation. So definitely, it's wonderful to talk to you. Thank you.